Welcome to part 2 in our 10-part series on prediabetes. Today we're talking about prediabetes decoded, diving into its development. So, how did you get prediabetes? It's really important to understand how we get it and what the potential consequences are. And we're going to be looking today into the factors that contribute to the development of prediabetes. In my last video, we talked about what it is. So you can go back to Pre-Diabetes 101, what is it, to get a more in-depth explanation of what it is. And basically, we're looking at increasing level of insulin resistance that's making it harder and harder for us to metabolize carbohydrates properly. Prediabetes is important to recognize because it is a warning sign that indicates an increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes. So it's very important to figure out if you're suffering from this early and intervene and get it reversed to prevent it progressing into diabetes. So we're going to look at a number of factors related to the development of prediabetes, like genetics, lifestyle factors, and other contributing factors. So let's look at genetics. Statistically speaking, you are at risk for prediabetes if you are overweight, if you're 45 years or older, and you have a parent, brother, or sister with type 2 diabetes. And that's risk factors according to the CDC, Center for Disease. Now, in a family where type 2 diabetes is prevalent, something like my family, a person has a 40% chance of developing diabetes if one parent has type 2 diabetes, and 70% if both parents have it. So it does make a difference what kind of genes you're inheriting. But one of the things I want to make very clear around the genetic component here is that heredity is like a gun, right? It loads the gun. But our second thing that we're going to talk about here, lifestyle factors, is what pulls the trigger. So just because you've inherited a tendency to type 2 diabetes doesn't mean you have to get it. There are many lifestyle choices that can impact your risk of actually developing it. Even if you do all the right things, it's not necessarily a guarantee that you would never develop type 2 diabetes, but it definitely reduces that risk and can often make it later in life before you get it, or get it not quite as severe. So it doesn't really matter as much what your heredity is as what you do about it. So let's talk about those lifestyle factors that set you up for the development of prediabetes. Number one is a sedentary lifestyle. So if you are not active, you're not moving around, you're not getting regular exercise, you are much more likely to develop prediabetes, because as you don't use your muscles like they were created to be used, your insulin sensitivity drops and your glucose metabolism is impacted negatively. So your muscles have fuel in them prepared for you to move. If you don't move, that fuel doesn't get used up, and those cells become fat and sassy, as some people like to say. So when they're fat and sassy, they're like, the glucose comes by, tries to get in, and they're like, no, no, glucose, we don't need you. We've got all the energy we need, because they're full of fat. As you move and exercise, it uses up those energy stores in your muscles, making room for additional deposits of glucose as you eat each meal. So physical activity makes a huge difference in your ability to take glucose up from the bloodstream. So how can you incorporate physical activity into your daily routines? There's a number of ways to do it. Often recommend a goal of something like 10,000 steps, or about 4 miles a day, for optimal aerobic exercise. And that would be just like brisk walking. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, doesn't require a gym or gym shoes, just something comfortable to walk in. And so that is a great way to incorporate some physical activity simply. It's cheap, it's easy, and you can do it just about anywhere, including walking around the coffee table in your living room. But I know that sounds a little boring, and it is, but there are a lot of options when it comes to walking. So find one that works for you and that you can be consistent with, and it'll make a huge difference in the development of prediabetes for you. Another area of lack of physical activity that really affects your glucose metabolism is what you do right after you eat. Many people eat and then, wow, that's the wonderful time to get into your easy chair and relax for an hour, maybe take a little snooze. And that is the worst thing that you can do. Because even if you're not diabetic, we know from the research that your risk of getting senile goes up dramatically if you have a habit of sleeping or sitting still after meals. So, one of the best things you can do for yourself is to get up and move around after a meal for at least 20 to 30 minutes. It makes a huge difference in how your body will metabolize glucose. So figure out some way to incorporate some exercise on a regular basis, and it will make a big difference in the level of insulin resistance you're experiencing. But there's some other factors, some other lifestyle factors. Another one is poor dietary choices. So when we don't make good choices around our food, that also can push insulin resistance. One of the most important macronutrients in relation to insulin resistance is fat. Our macronutrients are carbohydrates, proteins, and fat. Fat seems to be the most powerful macronutrient to push insulin resistance. More fat, more insulin resistance. More fat, a higher risk of prediabetes. More fat, more diabetes. In fact, they took some medical students, this is some years ago, and they were perfectly healthy young medical students, and they decided to see if they could make them diabetics. And so what they did is they actually fed them like 2 weeks or so. I don't remember the exact amount of time, but about 2 weeks of a high sugar diet. So they were getting sugar in everything on their cereal, sugary muffins, sugary desserts. And they did that for several weeks and they retested them, and none of them had developed diabetes. They took the same group of young men and put them on about 2 weeks of a high fat diet. So they had lots of butter and cream and oils and all of those sorts of things. And in just 2 weeks, more than half of them had developed diabetes. And so we see that high levels of fat are one of the things that really push the development of prediabetes, which can then lead to diabetes. So avoiding processed foods where a lot of oil is hidden, as well as things like deep fat fried foods, French fries, onion rings, battered mushrooms, all of those are things that really pack a lot of fat. And so they really push insulin resistance in your body. So you want to really pay attention to what those food components are on your plate and watch the amount of fat. As you drop the amount of fat in your diet, it will increase your glucose sensitivity. And that leads us right into the next lifestyle factor, which is carrying extra weight and being obese. There is a very close link between excess weight and prediabetes. Now, obviously, you can develop prediabetes without having any excess weight. So just because you're skinny doesn't mean you can't get it. It is simply a little more common in people that are carrying extra fat. Because what happens is, remember how we talked about those muscle cells that were full of fat, being fat and sassy and not wanting to take up glucose? Well, the more fat we are storing in our body, the less our body feels like it needs energy for fuel. And so instead of burning it, it tends to store it. And the more fat that is stored in the cells, the more insulin resistant you become. So excess body fat definitely is linked to insulin resistance. And often losing that extra weight will improve insulin resistance significantly. So what are the ways to do that? Well, the best ways to move towards your ideal weight is to look carefully at your plate and make sure that you are moving in the direction of a plant-based diet and including lots, and I mean lots, of leafy green vegetables, lots of other above the ground vegetables that are stems, leaves, or flowers. That would include things like asparagus and celery, cabbage, kale, Brussels sprouts. All of those are wonderful foods for helping us to become more insulin sensitive. So that's one of the best ways you could start improving what you're eating, is just adding more green leafy vegetables. Another one is replacing your animal proteins with plant proteins like beans. Beans, peas, chickpeas, lentils, split peas, all of those sorts of things make great replacements for animal protein. They also bring many more nutrients and, very importantly, fiber with them. So that's something to think about. Now, another contributing factor to the development of prediabetes is age. In fact, we see as people age, their risk of developing prediabetes goes up. In fact, in the United States, we find that as you get into the elder years, 80s and 90s, a huge percentage of people either have prediabetes or have actually moved into diabetes. So as we look at these other lifestyle things that can really make a difference, it's important to understand that age doesn't have to bring it on, and that in fact, as you age, you can maintain good health by having really good health habits in place. There are also some medical conditions and medications that can contribute to the development of prediabetes. Medications, especially, are things like steroids that tend to push blood sugars up. And there are also some more rare medical conditions that can contribute to the development of insulin resistance and that decreased sensitivity to insulin that makes it hard to take up glucose. Things like polycystic ovarian syndrome, or PCOS, is the way that prediabetes manifests. That resistance to insulin and that inflammation manifests that way in many women. So you see that there are a lot of factors that play into the development of prediabetes, and addressing any or each of these factors can really reduce your risk of developing prediabetes. If you already have it, it can help you to reverse prediabetes. So once again, our key points are that it's important to address prediabetes because if not addressed, it often turns into type 2 diabetes. If you have a genetics for it, you have a family history of diabetes, be extra careful and make sure you're being monitored on a regular basis so that you pick it up early if you start to develop issues. And lifestyle factors like being sedentary, making poor dietary choices, carrying excess weight and obesity, as well as advancing age, can all contribute to the development of prediabetes. So it's important to think now about the lifestyle changes that you can incorporate to prevent pre-diabetes. Make sure that you're getting regular checkups, that you're getting your A1C checked, that you are doing the things that make it very important for you to be able to pick up when the problems start and that they don't get to advance. So just check out the link in the description for this video, and I've got a free tool that can help you look at some really simple baseline assessments, things like body measurements that can really help you to see if you're on the road to prediabetes or even help you know if you have diabetes. Remember, 90% of Americans with prediabetes don't know they have it. And I'm on a campaign to make sure you're not one of those 90%. So thank you for watching, and make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to this channel if you've enjoyed this information and you want to make sure you get notified when I drop another video. Remember, health is wealth, and it comes by choice, not by chance.